Hey, this cockroach will crawl into your ear at night if you don't subscribe and click like within 5 seconds. Good luck.
Storytime about how my neighbor tried to unalive me. 4 years ago, my husband and I had just moved into a new neighborhood. We were newly married and were trying to have kids right away. My husband and I were also really social, so we would invite our neighbors over and host parties. We had a really big, beautiful house with a pool, so we always took advantage. Mostly everyone on our block would come to our get-togethers, but there was always this one couple that never showed up. I didn't think anything of it until one of my neighbors told me not to invite them to any other event in the future. When I asked her why, she said the police would go off into their house, and that the husband and the family was suspected of abusing the entire family. Obviously, after this, I stopped inviting them. Every single day, I would go on walks with my husband. Well, one night, my husband decided to stay home, so I went by myself. I decided to change my route and walk in front of the neighbor's house, the one everyone was scared of, and as soon as I turned down the street, I saw a man by the window. I looked away really fast because I didn't want him to think that I was staring, although I was. Suddenly, his front door opens and he comes outside. And all he says is, "You're the new neighbor, right?" I simply replied, "Yes, and nice to meet you." He stared at me for a few seconds, didn't say anything, and closed his door. I obviously thought this was strange. I kept walking, but a few minutes later, I noticed that he was right behind me, and something told me to run back home, which I did. That's when I realized he knew where I lived. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I ran back home as quickly as I could. I told my husband that the neighbor followed me home, but he told me to just forget about it. A few days later, I come home from running some errands. I get out of my car, and out of the corner of my eye, I see my neighbor standing behind a tree, and I could tell that he's looking at me. I decided to just ignore it because I didn't actually want to have to make conversation. Instead, I grabbed the groceries and walked into the house. I began closing the door, but he pushed his way in. I backed away and asked him what he wanted. He asked me if my husband was home. And no, my husband was not home, but I said yes. Then he looks around and asked me if he could get a little tour of the house. He also said that he really wanted to see the pool. Okay, I know what you're gonna think, but I was so scared I thought that if I just showed him the house, he would leave. I walk him over to the backyard and he starts looking around. That's when he asked me if we had any security cameras. My hands and knees started to shake, and once again I lied and said yes. He started looking around some more and said, "Nope, you definitely don't have any." I told him I needed to leave the house and if he could just leave. He starts to laugh and tells me that I should be nicer to him. He ripped my phone out of my hands and threw it into the pool. Instantly, I sprinted away from him. He grabbed my hair and I fell really hard to the ground. Part 3 is up. Part 3 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. He pulled my hair hard and I fell to the ground. That's when I just started kicking as hard as I could. I heard him scream and he fell back. I got up and ran straight back into the house and locked the door behind me. He came up to the door and started banging on it. He told me if I didn't let him in that he would break the door. That's when he grabbed a chair and started throwing it against the glass. Luckily, the windows are hurricane proof so he couldn't come in. I called 911 and then my husband. I went around the house locking every single door and window. He would just follow me from window to window yelling at me. He told me he just wanted to talk to me and that I was overreacting. Finally, I could hear the sirens around the corner. And of course, he started running away. Finally, the cops found him. His pockets, they found zip ties, and his car was loaded with rope and different things. Apparently, he planned on taking me to the woods. He's now in prison, but I'm so scared that he'll get out. What should I do? Storytime about how I caught my mom hooking up with my guy best friend. Disclaimer, this is not my storytime. Send me on Instagram. My best friend and I have known each other for 7 years. Let's call him Mark. Mark and I met when we were in school, and we have been inseparable since then. Everyone's constantly telling us that we should date, but we're not into each other like that. Last year, my parents started fighting a lot because my dad found out that my mom cheated on him. And she cheated on him with my dad's best friend. My mom's the kind of woman that constantly seeks attention from men. And growing up, she weirdly competed with me. Like anytime I liked a boy, she would flirt with him in front of me. So yeah, my mom's not the best when it comes to stuff like that. So when my dad found out that my mom was cheating on him, I basically just wanted to keep the peace. And I convinced my dad to not get a divorce. Huge mistake. Fast forward to 2 months ago. Mark was just about to turn 20, so I had been planning a birthday party for him. Because of COVID, I was only inviting our immediate family and close friends. And of course, my mom had to interject and wanted to help me plan everything. I told her several times I didn't need her help, but she insisted. Let me just say this, before any of this happened, it never occurred to me that my mom was even attracted to Mark. I saw him as like a brother to me, so I assumed that she would see him the same way. My mom and dad kept arguing every single day. Mark would come over and he would just let me vent to him. The day of Mark's birthday party is when I started noticing some weird things. My mom, of course, had to drink a lot of champagne, so she was getting a little tipsy. She insisted on dancing with Mark and like making this big scene, so they started dancing. More people joined the dance floor and it became like a real party. A few hours later, I see my mom and Mark sitting on the couch, but my mom is crying her eyeballs out, complaining about my dad, and Mark is just there listening to her. I mean, she's putting him in a weird position. I literally had to peel my mom off of Mark and take her home and put her into bed. Thankfully, Mark just thought it was funny, so he didn't get upset. A few weeks later, I come home and find Mark in the kitchen with my mom. Once again, my mom is drinking and complaining about my dad. And once again, Mark is just listening to her. But here's the thing. My mom was standing there in a bikini, supposedly ready to get in the pool. Part 2 is... So my mom is standing there in a bikini trying to seduce my guy best friend. Disclaimers is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I asked my mom nicely to go put on some clothes and she refused. So I grabbed Mark's hand and told him to come upstairs with me. I asked him what was going on between him and my mom and he said nothing. And he even said that I was ridiculous for even suggesting something like that. And I believed him, so I let it go. A few days later, my mom is dressed up all sexy in a red tight dress, supposedly making breakfast for my dad and I. But my dad had already left for work and I was going to school, so she knew that. I had the feeling that she had Mark coming over and she didn't want me to know. So I got in my car and told her I I was leaving for school. Instead, I waited around the corner and I saw Mark driving up to the house. I waited for about 10 minutes and then I quietly pulled into the driveway and opened the door. And what do you know, my mom is sitting on the countertop making out with my guy best friend. And they were going at it. Like if I hadn't gotten there, it would have happened, you know? I slammed the door and my mom jumps off the counter. Mark pretends that nothing's wrong and tells me that he has to go to school. But of course, I didn't let him leave. That's when my mom told me that they were in love. And what do you know, Mark confirmed it. That's when my mom basically begged me not to tell my dad anything. And that her and Mark are going to continue seeing each other. I told my mom I'd keep the secret. But instead, I drove straight to my dad's job and told him everything. He went straight to his lawyer and filed for divorce. And he confronted her. My mom basically said that I was lying and that I had for some reason made everything up. Mark, on the other hand, is totally in love with her, but she's telling him to leave her alone. So she also broke his heart. He doesn't even want to go back to school and he's begging me to get my mom and him back together. I told him that that would never happen because my mom is never going to leave my dad. My dad makes a lot of money and she has no job. He provides her a lifestyle that Mark could never. Now here's the thing, my mom's accusing me of being a terrible daughter for telling my dad, but how could I not tell my dad? I mean, am I the asshole here? I doubt it, but what do you guys think? What should I do? Story time about how I lied to my parents about having a boyfriend for 4 years. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. My parents are super strict. Growing up, I could not have any guy friends. I wasn't even allowed to go over to my girlfriend's houses. At school, I was pretty popular, and the fact that my parents didn't let me have any boyfriends made the boys actually want me more, which is something my dad actually hated. Boys would call our house asking to talk to me, and my dad would grill me about it. So I finally decided to tell him that because he doesn't let me date any boys, that boys want me more. He laughed and said that that wasn't true, and that most likely I was just provoking these boys. Obviously, this really upset me. My dad was always really controlling. When I turned 16, I decided I wanted to get my own job. This way I could have some more freedom and just meet more people outside of school. I started working at a local restaurant and quickly made friends with everyone who was working there. They were all pretty much my age, especially one boy. Let's call him Rick. Rick and I hit it off right away. I had a huge crush on him instantly, and I could tell that he liked me too. But of course, my strict parents were always present in my mind, so I tried my best to stay away from Rick just so that I wouldn't develop any feelings, which I already had, who am I kidding? One day, Rick asked me if I wanted to take my break with him, and I said yes. He sat in his car for 30 minutes and just talked the entire time. I started falling in love with him. We talked so much, and he was so kind and so funny. The next few days at work, we were basically inseparable. Finally, at the end of the week, he asked me if I wanted to be his girlfriend, and I said yes. Without a moment of hesitation, I said yes, knowing that my parents would not want that at all. So here's when I told him that we needed to keep this a secret. He wanted to just speak to my parents, but I begged him not to. Thankfully, he understood. The only time we were able to spend together was at work. And we did this for a full year. When I turned 17, my parents insisted that I quit my job so that I could focus on school. I pretty much had to listen to them, so I did. This meant that Rick and I barely ever saw each other. Instead, I decided to sneak him into my house every single night. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my husband and my dad got into a fist fight on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. My dad is in the military, therefore he is super strict. He's never liked any of my boyfriends and especially my fiance. My fiance is a musician, so he sometimes doesn't have a lot of income. So my dad thinks that he's absolutely lazy. I have a really good job and I always end up making a lot more than my fiance. This means that I have to make up for his lack of money. So usually I end up paying for most of the bills and my fiance ends up paying for about a third of our rent. And we do live in a nice fancy apartment. I mean, we've got a pool, a sauna, there's a bunch of amenities, and most of the time my fiance only gives me about $500 towards rent. My dad knows all of these issues, and trust me, it is an issue for me because I want him to be able to provide for me and our babies whenever I get pregnant, but it really irks my dad. But of course, it really bothers my dad. Every time my fiance and I go over to my parents for dinner, my dad is always making comments about how he doesn't earn enough money, and he asks him, like, how are you going to provide for your family? And that's when my fiance and him usually get into a fight. Our wedding day was quickly approaching, so I wanted to keep a distance between my fiance and my dad. Everything was good up until the reception. My now husband and I were saying hello to friends. Out of nowhere, my dad tackles my husband down. That's when all hell breaks loose. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my husband and my dad got into a fist fight on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. So my dad body slams my new husband onto the ground. Then, of course, all of my husband's friends come attack my dad and try to pull him off of my husband. By the way, my dad is super strong. Like I said in part 1, he's in the army, so he's built and super strong. My dad and my husband were pummeling each other. They were even kicking each other on our wedding day. Yeah, I'm in my wedding dress crying, while everyone else is going crazy. Luckily, I invited a friend, and her boyfriend is a cop. So he went up to my dad, who was clearly the stronger one in the fight, and was able to restrain him. When they were finally separated, my dad started yelling at my husband, calling him a liar and a cheater. And when I heard my dad say that, my stomach dropped. I knew that my dad had my back and that he probably found out something about my husband. My dad grabs my hand and pulls my mom into a separate room. Then he shows me pictures of my husband with another woman in a parking lot. That's when my dad explained to me that he didn't trust my fiance, so he decided to hire a private investigator to follow him around. Remember in part 1 I said that I was paying for almost everything in our relationship? My dad really hated this, and he was convinced that instead of going to work, work, my fiance was spending time with another woman. And guess what? He was right. Of course, my dad felt really bad about causing a whole scene, but that's when he told me that we had to annul the marriage. I honestly didn't know what to do at the time, so I told my dad that I needed to speak to my husband. My friend's boyfriend, the cop, was there the whole time. He took my dad out of the room and then brought in my husband. Of course, my mom stayed in the room with me to have some backup, and we grilled my husband for about 20 minutes. First, he denied everything, but when I showed him the picture that my dad showed me, he said it was just a friend. Of course, my mom and I weren't buying it. That's when he finally confessed that it was his old girlfriend and that they were just saying goodbye for one last time. That's when he showed me all the text messages between him and his ex, and everything was pretty innocent. I asked him why he didn't tell me that he was going to go see his ex, and he told me that he just didn't want any drama with my dad. The cop brought my dad back in the room. I asked him to stay inside while my dad and my husband and I talked. Explained to my dad everything that happened, but he wasn't buying his story. My dad kept saying that we just needed to get a divorce. My husband was crying and begging me to forgive him. Then my dad started attacking him again. Once again, the cop had to restrain him and he put him in a chokehold. Part 3 of how my dad attacked my husband on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My dad attacked my husband for a second time. Luckily, my friend's boyfriend, who was a cop, was there and was trying to manage the situation. Basically, we called off the entire reception. So $7,000 right down the drain. My husband and I were supposed to leave that night to Greece. I told my parents we should still go on the honeymoon and they agreed. But obviously, my dad was really upset about it. But while we were in Greece, I caught my husband texting his ex again. This woman texted him saying that she missed him. Then he told her about the fight he got into with my dad. Then she said that my whole family is crazy and that he shouldn't have married into it. I confronted my husband and he told me that he needed her as a friend and that I just needed to deal with it. Then I told him that I was the one that paid for basically everything in our relationship, including most of our wedding and our honeymoon, and that he needed to be grateful to me and to my family. That's when he said that he would never speak to my family again. That's when I told him that the relationship wasn't gonna work then. Now that we're back home, my parents really want me to get a divorce, but I'm not sure. Obviously, he has feelings for his ex and so does she. But I mean, I still love him. Why should I lose out? My husband is being super distant and barely talks to me. My dad is upset with me too because I haven't gotten a divorce.